He locked the doors of his den, for he wanted no intruding servants to discover him at the game. If a servant happened to discover him fondling a precious stone, it would have caused him no embarrassment, but to have somebody find him playing with dolls would have thrown him into a fit. So he would have his breakfast early, then go upstairs to the den, lock the door, pull the chair up to the doll's house, and begin to play. At first he did it only in the mornings. In the afternoons, after lunch, he would devote himself to the other parts of his collection. But the doll's house drew him more and more, and he became impatient with everything else, like a child who cannot eat lunch in the intensity of his desire to have done and get back to his toys, and soon he gave up the rest of the collection altogether. Now he devoted himself morning, noon, and night to the doll's house. The diamond lay forgotten in its velvet bed. There were no more caresses for the ivory. Gresham's whole life was in the doll's house. When his fingers became more accustomed to the little things, he let his fancy roam. For the first time in his life, Gresham played games. He began to rearrange the furniture, to rehang the pictures, to move the tiny rugs about. He exchanged andirons from the fireplace on the fourth floor with those from a fireplace on the second. And most of all, and best of all, he played with the little people. He moved the children in the parlor so that they all surrounded the grandmother instead of facing her. He liked it that way for a week. Then he put them back again. In the kitchen, a tiny buxom servant, all in white, stood bending over the wood stove. Gresham moved her so that she stood over the sink instead. He kept her there. The baby in the swan bed he did not touch at all. He liked it where it was, under the lovely flight of angels. There were other people in the other rooms, men and women and children. These he deployed and maneuvered. He became the ultimate in interior decorators. He could arrange the inhabitants of the house, put them and keep them where they looked best to him. In a short time, Gresham began to talk to himself. At least the servants passing in the hall, passing swiftly and discreetly past the den, hearing his voice, making an unaccustomed cooing sound, assumed he was talking to himself. This they did not take amiss. Anything might be expected from Mr. Gresham. Talking to himself in the privacy of his most private chamber was quickly and tacitly accepted as simply one of more eccentricity. But the truth of the matter was that Gresham was not talking to himself. He was conversing with the little people. "Now," he said, as he tipped the grandmother lightly back in her rocker and made her swing back and forth. "Isn't that comfy?" He sat there tipping the rocker. Every time it gave signs of stopping in its arc. Slyly, swiftly, he would lift his eyes from the grandmother in the parlor and aim his glance at the master bedroom. "What? Johnny? Mary? Kissing soon as my back is turned?" With admonitions, he would turn John and Mary back to back. "Don't want anybody hurt around here," he would say slyly. With the children, he was just as solicitous. He soon gave names to each one of them, and he coddled them until they might have been the most splendid brats in Christendom. "Emma," he would say, "did you enjoy your lunch today?" For he had gotten into the habit of moving the children and their elders into the dining room at meal hours, sitting them at their proper places and changing the plates and removing the silver for every pretended course. He stopped short only at serving them food. He preserved his sanity to that extent. At night, however, he moved every one of the little people into beds in the various bedrooms, and in the morning he awakened them with a cheery, "Good morning." 7 weeks of this, and Gresham began to evolve his theory. It was a simple theory. One comes to examine it in the light of all pertinent facts. It was almost a natural theory. Gresham began to figure that he was God. Why not? He had purchased, for an exorbitant fee, a world of his own. The creatures in it he owned body and soul. Over these creatures he exercised an authority complete, unquestioned, irrevocable. His hand moving among these walls was, why not, the hand of destiny. What is the meaning of destiny? Whatever the words that describe it, in whatever definition, it always has some secret concern with the future. Then, the hand that controls the future, is it not the very hand of destiny, only in Gresham's brain, only on Gresham's sufferance did the future of the little people exist. Gresham's pudgy fingers moved through the rooms, arranging furniture and liaisons and lives with the tender mercy of a benevolent God. What was he, then, but God Almighty to this household, this world, this universe of his very own? Thus the theory took shape. Thus it rolled around in his brain, gathering momentum. He drew a picture for himself. He conceived of the world as a series of worlds, one within the other, each with its own God, and the gods growing progressively larger and interlocking, like one of those astounding oriental balls within balls. Gresham was god of the doll's house. Another was god of Gresham's world, and another was god of that god. No, it wasn't so much like that oriental ball. It was more like a telescope. As he sat in his chair, moving his little people backward and forwards, upstairs and downstairs, controlling the present and the future of everything and everybody in that house, that world, that universe, he, Gresham, knew that he was God. It added a ticklish pleasure to the game. Now he had a divine scheme. Now he created such a rigid routine for his people that he could not leave the room anymore except to retire to his bedroom for sleep. He dressed and undressed his creatures twice a day, read solemn bedtime stories to the children, and conversed long hours with the adults. Now Gresham had all his meals sent to the den, and he was impatient with the servants when they took too long laying out the tray for him, or picking up the empty dishes after he had hurriedly dined. The moments were precious to him. He had so many things to do for his people. Up to that point, up to the moment of the formation of his theory, Gresham had been a benevolent God. Now, with his catechism set, he began to ponder the ways of all gods, and that started him exercising a little of the extra privileges of his class. After all, a god has to tinker. He began inflicting certain discomforts, even pain, upon his creatures. One day he tipped the little grandmother so far back in her chair she fell out and lay in a heap on the floor. "See," Gresham told her, "life isn't all comfy." Now, whenever one of the children was a little perverse in his movements, refusing to stand or sit in quite the manner Gresham had in mind, he took to spanking it. "Let that teach you a lesson," he shouted. "Do as you're told. Conform." The change from benevolent to vindictive God grew with his growing realization of the absolute power he possessed. Up till now he had been charmed by his playthings, and had acted like a father to an adopted family. Now, when the Father became the Heavenly Father, he indulged himself in his omniscience. When the children weren't looking, he stole toys from the playroom. He hid them in the kitchen. One day he took the knitting needles from the grandmother's hands. "Enough damn knitting!" he stormed at her. "Try working for a living. Sweat of your brow!" He took her rocking chair and all, and dumped her in the kitchen. He even attacked the swan crib and the sleeping infant. He knocked the crib over, and the infant came tumbling out, rolling over and over on the floor. "Train 'em young," said Gresham. "Teach 'em life's full of hard knocks." He let the infant lay on the floor for 2 days. He pretended to pay no attention to the wailing sound he heard. They found Gresham later in a pool of blood, his head cracked in places like an egg tapped with a spoon. The glass of the window in the den had been smashed to bits. The theory of the police was that Gresham had climbed to the windowsill in order to throw himself out the window. Then, being a fat and awkward man, he had bumped into the glass, shattering it. That he had then suffered some sort of attack. Or had tripped and had fallen over backwards on his head. That was the way the police figured it out. But Gresham himself would have told them a different story about what had happened that night. He could have told them that he had had an extremely trying day with his flock. Nobody stood up correctly. The furniture didn't look right. The baby wouldn't go to sleep. "Damn it!" he had screamed. "Shut up, all of you! Do as I say, or damn it, you'll roast in hell!" In anger, he kept moving things about with clumsy impatience. Beds, chairs, rugs, pictures, people, and the index finger of his right hand, probing into the far corners of the infant's nursery, felt something it had never felt before. It was high up, toward the ceiling of the room, which is why Gresham's eyes and fingers had never found it before. He had never stopped low enough to see he had never stooped low enough to see the ceilings of the second floor. Now he bent over to look, and when he saw it, he growled. He ripped it from a triangular shelf high up in the corner. It was a tiny religious figure. It might have been a Madonna. He held it in the palm of his hand. It was all green and gold, painted over plaster. There was flower-like calligraphy on the folds of its cloak, and a benign expression upon a face as large as the head of a hat-pin. He held it in his hand for some minutes. Then he had to loosen his tie. Then he held the thing between his thumb and index finger, and with one powerful squeeze he crushed it to powder. He flicked it from his fingertips. "Fools!" He rose from his chair and stood face to face with the house. He lifted his right hand clear over his left shoulder. His eyes were terrible. With one stroke of his arm he could end existence for all of them. Then and there he shuddered, a wrathful god. "No other gods before me," he began. "No," but his arm came slowly down to his side again. He quivered a little, but he did not strike. He subsided, a forgiving god. That was the night Gresham could not sleep. Jealousy tore at his eyelids, gnawed inside him. An ancient dyspepsia crept back in and gave him twinges until he knew he could lie there no longer and simply stare at the ceiling. "Idols," he murmured. "Heathen idols!" His pajamas were wet with sweat. Jealousy seeped through his pores. He tossed on the damp sheets until he could stand it no more. He rose from the bed and strode with mighty steps out of the bedroom, into the hallway, into the den. It was a dark night. No moonlight came through the windows. It was late, the blackest late part of night. He wanted no light for what he was about to do, so he did not turn on the switch. It took him minutes for his eyes to see through the darkness. The first thing they saw, of course, was the doll's house. He walked noiselessly, with a fat man's grace up to it. "I gave you life," he said in an even voice. "Now—" Once more he raised his heavy right arm over his left shoulder. He raised himself on his toes. This time he brought the back of his hand down against the house with all his strength, and what occurred first was the splintering of the wood where his hand hit. A split-second sound of splintering. The blow swept the whole marvelous house off the table, and it fell to the floor with a great crash. It was no sturdy framework that held the house together. Too precise it was, and too delicate to be that strong. The framework caved in like glass. In a heap, then, at Gresham's feet, lay a shattered mass of splinters and bits of glass, and the irreplaceable furniture, and the little people torn pieces of the incomparable wallpaper, all in a rubble, like the rubble after a bombing. "You fools!" Gresham shouted. It was the back of Gresham's hand that had smote the building. Now the knuckles were bleeding. The hand was at his side, and the blood dripped on the floor. "You fools!" he shouted. "Never heard of a day of judgment? Wouldn't believe me when I warned you? The power of life is the power of death. I warned you." He raised the wounded hand and looked at it. The blood ran down his forearm. "Wash you in the blood. I'll wash you in the blood, you stupid, disobedient people." He stood over the rubble and shouted and exulted and sweated. God, even a god cannot be entirely calm after producing an earthquake. Gresham could not keep his arms from shaking, but he knew he could go to sleep now. The evildoers had been slaughtered. Vengeance had been wrought. But when he walked to the window, first he wanted, for some strange reason, to look at the night sky. He walked to the window and leaned heavily upon the sill. He was still breathing hard. His throat and his brain felt curiously congested. He climbed up on the broad sill, as if, by getting closer to the window, he could suck in more air. He stood there on the sill, leaning his full weight against the window, panting hard. He looked up at the sky. It was the faintest pale blue of the very early dawn. Not a single cloud floated there, nothing, till Gresham saw, from the immense void, covering half the shoulder of the sky, the back of an enormous hand was coming down at him, swiftly, powerfully, vengefully. And that is the end.